nights and you are out in the middle of nowhere. And there's been a lot of crime out in these very, very desolate desert areas. I'm going to dig into that, some of the things that have happened in the past out there, some of the bodies that have been discovered.
Breaking right now, it is just after 9 p.m. on a quiet night in the Catalina foothills just outside Tucson. No sirens cutting through the dark, no flashing lights drawing attention, just unmarked vehicles, federal agents, sheriff's deputies, and the execution of 2 search warrants authorized by a judge. Warrants that were not rushed, not reactive, but built carefully over several days of focused investigation. Inside a residence located roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, a 37-year-old man and his elderly mother were escorted out, both detained as law enforcement moved in. This was not random. This was not chance. According to Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, this operation was the result of targeted surveillance. Investigators had been watching, waiting, studying movements before making their move. For nearly a week, the identity of this man remained hidden from the public. And when that silence finally broke, it did not bring clarity. It raised even more questions that, to this moment, have not been fully answered. Tonight, we are going to take you through everything. Who this man is, what his past reveals, where he lives in relation to Nancy Guthrie, and why federal authorities believed this specific location was important enough to justify not 1, but 2 signed warrants. But more importantly, we are going to focus on something deeper. Not just what has been said publicly, but what has not been said at all. Because in an investigation like this, silence is never empty, carries weight. Stay with us, because when you connect the identity, the location, and the unanswered gaps, a pattern begins to form. One that has not been fully laid out until now. Welcome to the channel. Before we go any further, stop for a moment. Set everything aside and focus. Right now, we ask you to join in a moment of prayer for Nancy Guthrie. Not later, not at the end, but right now. Because this family has endured over 2 months of uncertainty, fear, and sleepless nights, we ask for guidance, for truth to come forward, and for Nancy to be returned safely. For protection over every viewer, every family, every home watching tonight. Type Amen if you stand with Nancy. Share your thoughts below. What you notice, what you remember, what you feel could matter. Because sometimes the smallest detail changes everything. Now, let's get into the details. Before we focus on any single individual, you need to understand the structure of this investigation. Because nothing you are about to hear exists in isolation. Every detail, every movement, every piece of evidence is connected to a timeline that investigators have been building step by step. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old, a grandmother, a woman with a routine, a life that followed patterns. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills, an area defined not just by wealth, but by predictability. It is the kind of neighborhood where people notice unfamiliar cars, where routines are not just habits, they are signals. And when something breaks that pattern, it stands out. On the night of January 31st, everything followed that pattern. Her family dropped her off after dinner. The garage closed. The lights went out. Nothing appeared unusual. But sometime between late night and early morning, something changed. Her doorbell camera stopped recording at 1:47 a.m. That is not a random failure. That is a moment. The next morning, Nancy did not show up where she was expected. Calls went unanswered. Concern turned into alarm. And when investigators entered her home, what they found did not point toward accident or coincidence. It pointed toward intention. This was not a fall, not a medical emergency, not confusion or wandering. This was a targeted act carried out by someone who had already made decisions before ever approaching that house. The FBI later released footage, a figure captured in the early hours of February 1st. Covered, controlled, moving with purpose, not rushing, not hesitating, wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, disabling the camera with precision. That detail matters, because it tells you something critical. This individual did not arrive unprepared. They came with a plan, and more importantly, they came expecting to execute it. And then, 2 miles away, investigators found something. A pair of gloves. Black, discarded, containing male DNA. That discovery did not close the case. It expanded it. Because when that DNA was run through CODIS, the national database, there was no match. No identity. No history. Just a profile with no name attached to it. And that is where the investigation shifts. Because when law enforcement does not get a name from DNA, they turn to something else. Geography. Distance becomes evidence. Movement becomes a pattern. And proximity begins to matter more than anything else. 0.2 miles. That distance is not random. It becomes a radius, a circle drawn around a crime scene, a boundary within which something meaningful may exist. Now consider this carefully. Investigators did not ask for footage from the entire city. They asked for footage from within that radius. Every home, every camera, every possible angle within that specific distance. That tells you something about what they believe. Not what they know, what they believe. And belief in an investigation is built from evidence that has not yet been made public. Now step back and look at how law enforcement operates in situations like this. They do not begin with certainty. They begin with fragments, a timeline, a location, a piece of physical evidence. And then they start building connections. One detail leads to another. One person leads to another. Pattern starts forming. And slowly, that pattern becomes strong enough to present to a judge. Because a search warrant is not speculation. It is an argument. An argument that says, based on what we know, there is a reasonable probability that evidence exists at a specific location. And that argument must be strong enough to meet a legal standard. Now think about what that means. By the time a warrant is signed, investigators are not guessing. They are presenting. They are saying, this location matters. And when two separate warrants are approved, one for a residence and one for a vehicle, that argument becomes even more specific. Because now, it is not just about a place. It is about movement. Where someone lives, where they go, what connects those 2 points, and how those connections might tie back to the original event. But here is where it becomes even more important. Law enforcement did not execute that warrant randomly. They did not arrive without preparation. They waited. They watched. They allowed time to pass. Because timing in an operation like this is everything. They chose a moment when the individuals inside that residence were no longer inside. They chose a location where they could control the situation. And then, on a public road, they made their move. A traffic stop. Not inside the home. Outside of it. Because legally, that changes everything. It allows detention without immediate arrest. It allows questioning. It allows collection. Physical samples. Statements. Observations. And while that was happening, another team entered the home. Searching. Documenting. Collecting anything that might connect back to that original moment at 1:47 a.m. Hours passed. Evidence was removed. A vehicle was secured and taken. And then, something that often confuses people happened. The individuals were released. Not cleared. Released. And that distinction matters more than it seems. Because in an active investigation, release does not mean resolution. It means the process is still moving. And at this point, the investigation is no longer just about what happened. It becomes about what can be proven. Now, before we go any further, there is something important that needs to be said clearly. N01 we are about to discuss has been charged in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. N01 has been convicted. And no official statement has declared any individual responsible. Everything you are about to hear is based on public records, confirmed actions by law enforcement, and statements made on the record. We are not drawing conclusions. We are building a picture. Because in cases like this, understanding the picture matters just as much as identifying a single point. Now, with that in mind, we can move forward. The name that surfaced after days of silence was Luke Daly. 37 years old. Living in Tucson. Not someone the public knew before this moment, but someone investigators already knew before that Friday night. And that detail matters. Because people do not become the subject of targeted surveillance without a reason. Surveillance takes time, resources. Authorization. It is not random. It is deliberate. And it begins long before anyone outside law enforcement is aware it is happening. Now, consider what we know from public records. Luke Daly has a criminal history. Not a single incident. A pattern. Between 2019 and 2020, he served time in state prison. Charges that included drug-related offenses, criminal damage, and attempting to evade law enforcement. That alone does not connect him to this case. But it places him within a system that a system law enforcement tracks. Because patterns mattered, in 2022, he was arrested again, convicted on charges related to drug distribution. Instead of returning to prison, he was placed on probation, which means something very specific. It means he remained under supervision. His movements, his behavior, his compliance, all monitored within a legal framework. Now move forward again. May 2025. Another arrest. This time in a Walmart parking lot. Possession of illegal substances and a firearm, alongside another individual. That arrest triggered a probation review. A moment where a judge had to decide whether he would remain in the community or be removed from it. The decision was made to allow him to stay, which means that at the time of the search warrants, he was still out, still living in the same area, still within that 2-mile radius. And that brings us back to geography, because geography in this case keeps repeating 0.2 miles. The gloves were found 2 miles away. The requested footage covered a 2-mile radius. And the residents under investigation sat within that same distance. 0.3 separate points, all connected by the same measurement. Now pause for a second and think about that. Not emotionally, logically. When investigators define a radius, they are not guessing. They are responding to something. Something physical, something measurable, something that places importance on distance. Now, within that radius, there are hundreds of homes, hundreds of people. Most of them have nothing to do with this case. Most of them were simply asked to provide footage, and that was the extent of their involvement. But one address was different. One address did not just receive a request. It received a warrant. Actually, 2. And that is the distinction that changes everything. Because a request is voluntary. A warrant is not. A warrant is backed by the authority of a judge, which means investigators presented enough information to justify entering that property and searching for evidence. Now add another layer. Before that warrant was executed, surveillance had already been in place, which means the decision to focus on this individual was made before any public action occurred. That timeline matters, because it shows progression. From observation.to suspicion.to legal action. And that progression is not accidental. Now, consider how that action unfolded. Law enforcement did not simply arrive and knock on the door. They coordinated, they waited, they positioned themselves. And when the moment came, they acted in multiple locations. A residence. A vehicle. Different points connected to the same individual. That kind of coordination does not happen without planning. And planning does not happen without purpose. Now here is where things become even more important. After the operation, after the detention, after the search, something very specific happened. There was no announcement of charges, no confirmation of arrest, no statement of resolution. Instead, there was silence, and within that silence, one word began to stand out. Released. Not cleared. Released. Those two words may sound similar, but in an investigation, they are completely different. Cleared means eliminated. Released means ongoing. It means the process is not finished. It means there are still questions that have not been answered. Now, at the same time, another name surfaced. Another individual connected through prior incidents. Detained, questioned, released. Again, no charges. Again, no conclusions. But the timing matters, because these actions did not happen weeks apart. They happened within hours. Back-to-back operations tied to the same investigation, which tells you something else. This is not a single thread case. It is multi-layered, multiple angles, multiple points of interest, all being examined at the same time. And when that happens, investigators are not just looking for one answer, they are looking for connections between people, between locations, between events. And sometimes those connections are not immediately visible. Sometimes they only appear when you step back and look at everything together. Now, this is where the investigation stops being just about evidence and starts becoming about language, about what is said and what is not. Because in a case like this, public statements are not accidental. They are measured, carefully chosen, reviewed before they are ever spoken. And when you listen closely, the difference between two words can tell you everything. After the search warrants were executed, after the detentions, after the evidence was collected, the question everyone wanted answered was simple. Is he cleared? It is the most direct question you can ask in an investigation like this. And the answer should be just as direct. Yes. Or no. But that is not what happened. Instead, the response was controlled, careful. We will continue our work. We have evidence to process. Statements that move the conversation forward without closing anything. And that is where attention shifts. Because at another moment in the same investigation, when members of Nancy Guthrie's family were being discussed publicly, the response was completely different. Clear, definitive, emotional. They were defended. By name. The accusations against them were called cruel. They were described as victims. And most importantly, they were cleared. That word was used. Publicly. Without hesitation. Now place. Those two moments side by side. In one, strong language. Direct statements. Clear conclusions. In the other, restraint. Distance. Ongoing process. No finality. That difference is not random. Because investigators understand the impact of every word they use. They know how the public interprets language. They know how media repeats it. And they know how it shapes perception. So when one group is clearly and publicly removed from suspicion, and another is not, that gap becomes meaningful. Not as proof, but as signal. And in an investigation built on signals, that matters. Now return to everything we have already established. The timeline, the evidence, the geography, the warrants, the surveillance, the detentions. None of those elements exist on their own. They intersect. They overlap. They reinforce each other. And when they all point toward the same area, the same radius, the same sequence of events, investigators pay attention. But even with all of that, there are still critical questions that remain unanswered. Questions that define where this case stands right now. We do not know if the DNA recovered from those gloves matches any individual who has been questioned. We do not know what was collected inside that home during the search. We do not know whether anything recovered directly connects back to Nancy Guthrie. We do not know if the person captured on camera has been identified. And we do not know if investigators are closer to an answer today than they were when this began. What we do know is this. This investigation is active. Evidence is still being processed. And law enforcement is still choosing what to say and what not to say. Now consider one final point. In an investigation this controlled, silence is not an absence. It is a decision. Every statement released is intentional. Every detail withheld is calculated. And that means when something is not said, when a name is not cleared, when a conclusion is not given, it carries weight. Not because it proves anything, but because it leaves space. Space for questions. Space for uncertainty. Space for the investigation to continue without limitation. And that is exactly where this case remains. Unresolved. Unfinished. And still moving. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. An entire timeline built around one moment in the early hours of the morning. A single point where everything changed. And everything after that has been an attempt to understand what happened in that space. Who was there? Why it happened? And where it leads next. So when you look at this case, do not look at just one detail. Look at the pattern. Look at the repetition. Look at what connects. Because sometimes the answer is not in what stands out. It is in what keeps showing up again and again. The same distance. The same sequence. The same silence. And until those questions are answered, until evidence turns into certainty and certainty turns into truth, this investigation does not stop. It continues. Piece by piece. Step by step. Until the moment comes when silence is replaced with something else. A name. A charge. An answer. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Day 63. She is 84 years old. She disappeared without her medication, without any warning, without any sign that she would not return. Somewhere tonight, a family is still waiting for an answer that has not come, still holding on, still refusing to accept silence as the end of her story. The tip line remains open. 1-800-CALL-FBI. There is over $1 million in reward money available, completely anonymous, no questions asked, no identification required. If you saw anything in the Catalina foothills area in the days leading up to February 1st, anything at all, a car that didn't belong, a person who seemed out of place, a moment that didn't feel right, this is the time to say it. Savannah Guthrie said it clearly. Someone out there knows something. And that one detail, no matter how small it feels, could be the piece that changes everything. Type amen in the comments if you are still standing with Nancy. Share where you are watching from tonight. Keep this story alive. Keep attention on this case, because it is not over. And when the truth comes out, you will want to be here when it does. Make sure you are subscribed.